I have been asked to do a talk. This is the first time we've actually done this talk anywhere outside of our Pfander course. So you're the first to get it. Your pastor and his wife wanted to do this talk especially. This is a hard-hitting talk. And I'm going to warn you, there are some things you're going to read that aren't very pleasant. But it's a talk that we are finding Muslims need to hear. There has been this perception around the world that slavery is uniquely a Christian problem, that slavery is uniquely a European, American, Western problem, that slavery has nothing to do with Islam. And especially in my country, in America, this is the only narrative you're going to hear. And it's bringing thousands upon thousands of young Afro-Americans to Islam. They're leaving the church in droves and becoming Muslims because of slavery. They're leaving the churches here in Britain, the Afro-Caribbeans, because of slavery. Now, this one I'm presenting today is not my work, okay? This is from a girl on our team, Sarah Foster. She has just flown to America. She just got back on Thursday from Gambia. If any of you know the significance of what I'm talking about, in America, if you're Afro-American and you want to know who your slave roots are, you go to Gambia, because this is where Roots, Alex Haley, when he wrote the book Roots, and when he did his research, Kunta Kinte, who was his forebear, came from Banjul, just out of Banjul, in Banjim, there in Gambia. And so what has happened, there is now an entire industry of Afro-Americans who are now flying to Gambia to find out about their historical roots in slavery. And though they don't know their own roots, they are now affiliating themselves with Kunta Kinte and with Alex Haley. And so she went there a week and a half ago to introduce this side of the coin. You're only looking at one side of slavery. You're only looking at 400 years of slavery. The European slave trade only lasted from 1400 to 1800. It was only 400 years long. It was eradicated by Christians. Wilberforce, the Clapham sect, here in Britain, were the ones that stood against slavery and were the ones that actually stopped slavery. This has never been done in the Muslim world. And so she introduced this just this last week and got an enormous amount of flack. She got quite a bit of pushback from the students because they had never heard this. In Banjul, in Gambia, 95% of the country is Islamic. There are very few Christians there. And they are dependent on the slave trade for tourism. All the tourists are Afro-Americans who are coming to find their roots. So to hear something like this, that actually Islam has a greater problem, because Islam has been involved in the slave trade for 1400 years, 1,000 years longer than the Europeans. The slave trade was always in Africa, and it was always controlled by Muslims. This is what they're not used to hearing. That 18 to 19 million slaves left the east coast of Africa, whereas only 11 million left the west coast of Africa. How many of you knew that before? Only 11 million left the west coast of Africa to come to the Americas, to come to Brazil, Central America, my country, United States. And we know where their progeny are today. They still exist today. There's about 100 to 120 million of them all over the Americas. Their descendants are well known. My former president, his wife Michelle Obama, is a descendant of slaves. We have 30 million of them in America alone. What about the 18 to 19 million that left the east coast of Africa? Where did they all go? None of them came to the Americas. They all went to the Muslim world. Where are their progeny? There should be 140 million of them today. Where are this 140 million? They don't exist. Why has Islam not even asked this question? So we're asking it. But she has gone way beyond as to why the slave trade has existed so prolifically, so much more so, and why there has never been an abolition movement in Islam. Islam has never abolished slavery. Muslim countries have, yes, they've had to. And almost in every case, they've had to, but under duress because of the United Nations. And the last countries in the world to abolish slavery were in 1960, Saudi Arabia, and 1981, Mauritania. Yet slavery still exists today in Sudan and Mali. And always, slavery is always Arabs enslaving Africans. Never the other way around. It has always been black slavery. So these are the questions she took with her. And so I'm going to use, this is her PowerPoint. I helped her with it a bit, but these are questions that we have dealt with. And so she and I got up on the ladder back in March of last year, and we actually filmed this on the ladder for the first time. 25,000 people have watched that film, just that one film already, and it's causing a huge furore. We're going to now film it much more professionally, and we're going to unpack much of what we're doing today, because she went way beyond slavery to look at colorism in Islam. What do the great men of Islam, what do they say about black people? Quote after quote. You're going to see what they're saying, and it's not very pretty. Okay, so let's go through it, and let's go into this whole introductory of slavery. The Muslim position, the Christian position, and the comparisons between the two. Now, the first things first, what is slavery? It's defined as one of the things that everyone agrees is unethical. The Bible and the Quran use the term slave and slavery in both positive and negative ways. Is a slave a thing or a person? Well, the neutral definition would be a person who is the property of and wholly subject to another, a bond servant. That would be the neutral definition, or a person entirely under the domination of some influence or person. Classical definition from back in Aristotle and the Roman private law was that slaves were the property essential, no different than a farm implement or domesticated animal. What's interesting is that the Aristotle definition did not consider slaves had anything to do with color. Anybody could be a slave, and many of the slaves in the Aristotelian time, and certainly in the Roman time, were white slaves. There was no such thing as only black slaves. They were all colors. They were all ethnic groups. Orlando Patterson says slavery is a process of dishonor, alienation, and social death. Concept of absolute power in the context of slavery. David Bryan Davis talks about it and says the more we learn about slavery, the more difficulty we have defining it. That's the problem. So the position of cultural anthropological scholars is this. Scholars do not agree on a definition of slavery. The term has been used at various times for a wide range of institutions, including plantation slavery, forced labor, the drudgery of factories and sweatshops, child labor, semi-voluntary prostitution, bride price marriage, child adoption for payment, and paid-for surrogate motherhood. Somewhere within this range, the literal meaning of slavery shifts into metaphorical meaning, but it is not entirely clear at what point. Defining slavery can either be from complete freedom on this side all the way to chattel slavery. Oh wait, you're looking the opposite direction. So complete freedom, am I correct? Is that the right side? All the way to chattel slavery over on this side. And anywhere in between. So there are so many definitions. People are saying people who work at McDonald's today, are they slaves? Because of the fact that they don't have many rights. So we have to be careful how we define slavery. The Muslim position is slavery is good, or it is ordained by Allah. Number two, slavery should not be practiced today as there is no genuine caliphate. Or number three, Islam came to abolish slavery. So you have all three categories, and you'll hear Muslims here in Britain who will adhere to all three categories. Permitted Islamic slavery, those who are prisoners of war, those who were born into slavery, all other forms they say have been abolished. That's what they say in Britain. But the status of a slave in Islam was very clear when you look at the Quran itself. Look at Surah 2, Ayah 178. O you who have believed, prescribed for you is legal retribution for those murdered, the free for the free, the slave for the slave. So the idea was like with like. In Surah 30, Ayah 22, and of his signs is the creation of the heavens and the earth and the diversity of your languages and your colors. Here's what's interesting, because this one is what was quoted just a few weeks ago when they had the National Day of Prayer in the United States after Trump's election. The National Day of Prayer, they had Muslims come up and quote this verse. This is the only verse you can find in the Quran that talks about diversity. Diversity of your languages and your colors. But it doesn't acknowledge as to whether or not one color is above the other in this verse. It was fascinating that they didn't go to 6 verses later, because it says just in 6 verses later that it's very clear that there are those who are slaves, those who are inferior to others. So there is maybe diversity in verse 32, but not in verse 22, but not in verse 28. Surah 49, verse 13, O mankind, indeed, we have created you from male and female and made you peoples and tribes. So it doesn't really give a distinction whether or not one is above the other. It just says there's quite many people of you. So you can see the difficulty Muslims are going to have if they're going to say that slavery should be abolished according to the Quran. We can't find any verses for that. Now, there is the idea that there is a protected view of treatment of slave in Sahih Muslim. He who beats a slave without cognizable offense of his or slaps him, then expiation for it is that he should set him free. So there is this view that you need to be careful how you treat slaves. There's also the view in Abu Dawud, which is another one of the 6 major compilations of the hadith, that there was only one camel, even that you have lost. He then begat to beat him, while the apostle of Allah, praise be unto him, was smiling. So here you have Allah even saying, yes, be careful of how you treat your slave, but when he saw one of his, Abu Bakr in this case, who later became a caliph, beating his slave, he smiled. So you can see even contradiction amongst traditions as to how they're to be treated. We do know about the slave son of Muhammad, Zayd, that he was given a enlightened stature. In Al-Tabari, it says in the beginning, at the time of Zayd, Muhammad took Zayd to the steps of the Kaaba, where his legal contracts were agreed and witnessed, and announced to the crowds, witness that Zayd becomes my son, with mutual rights of inheritance. And many Muslims will point to this and see Muhammad even elevated the status of his son, his slave, as his son, proving that Muhammad elevated slaves. Al-Tabari, volume 39. In accordance with the Arabic custom of adoption, Zayd was thereafter known as Zayd ibn Muhammad, and was a freed man, regarded socially and legally as Muhammad's son. Many Muslims will point to this and show this is proof of the magnanimity of Muhammad as a great model of how to treat slaves. In chapter 33, verse 40, Muhammad is not the father of any of your men, but he is the messenger of Allah and the seal of the prophets, and Allah has full knowledge of all things. Why did this verse get revealed? Al-Tabari tells us why. It was revealed because the Munafiqun made this a topic of their conversation and reviled the Prophet, saying, Muhammad prohibits marriage with the former wives of his own sons, but he has married the former wife of his own son, Zayd. What's going on here? To understand that, you need to go back in the traditions and realize what happened when Zayd was the wife of Zayd, came to visit Muhammad. He saw her to be beautiful. Zayd then goes home and tells Zayd what Muhammad had said. Zayd immediately divorces his wife and lets Muhammad marry her. Now, of course, here's a problem, because if she is the wife of your adopted son, or the wife of your son in this case, this goes against every Arab probity. In the Arab world, nobody can marry the wife of your son. So what happens? What had to be done? Well, Al-Tabari says Zayd reverted back to be known as the original name of Zayd ibn Haritha, and was no longer considered Muhammad's legal son after the revelation of Surah 33, ayah 5. So once he became the son of Muhammad, it became a problem because he could no longer take his wife, because that goes against Arab law. So then he reverted and eradicated any suggestion that he was his son anymore. Again, to alleviate the problem with marrying Zainab. So the example of Surah 33:50, O Prophet, those indeed we have made lawful to you your wives to whom you have given their due compensation, and those your right hand possesses from what Allah has returned to you. Those your right hand possesses, those are slave women. So anybody is perfect. It's perfectly okay for men to have as their wives slave women. Manumission is something that's difficult in Islam, because where are you going to find reference to manumission? They do exist in the Quran in Surah 24, ayah 33. There is a reference to contract being eradicated. Those who seek a contract for eventual emancipation from among whom your right hand possesses, then make a contract with them if you know there is within them goodness. Give them from the wealth of Allah, which He has given you. So it seemed to suggest in the Quran that slaves that want to be emancipated can do so. And Muslims love to point to Surah 24, ayah 33. The difficulty is, what are you going to do with Surah 8, ayah 67? O you who have believed, prescribed for you is legal retribution for those murdered, the free for the free, the slave for the slave, and the female for the female. Which means You can give a slave for a slave. So here it suggests that this alleviation from your Lord and a mercy, but whoever transgresses after that will have a painful punishment. Here you suggest that, wait a minute, you can't just let slaves go free, because slaves can be bartered back and forth, one for the other. That seems to suggest a difficulty with that first verse. So for ayah 92 also suggests that you can give a slave to pay or two free slave to pay the price of murder. Never is it for a believer to kill a believer except by mistake. And whoever kills a believer by mistake, then the freeing of a believing slave and a compensation payment presented to the deceased family. Or you can have a fast for 2 months, which seem to suggest that the slave is equal to fasting for 2 months. What does that do to what does that say about the importance of slaves, if that's with like and like? Or what about oath breaking? If you break an oath, the expiation of the feeding of 10 needy people, if you break an oath, from the average of that which you feed your own families, or clothing them, or the freeing of a slave. So here you have reference that when you want to expiate your breaking of oath, all you need to do is free a slave or fast for 3 days, suggesting that a slave is only worth 3 days of eating. Doesn't really give very much honor to the slave or show that they are in any ways equal to a human. What about Muhammad's example? Let's look at his example. What did he do? In Sahih Bukhari, it narrates that Bilal said to Abu Bakr, if you have bought me for yourself, then keep me. But if you have bought me for Allah's sake, then leave me for Allah's work. So Muslims would point to this and say, see, Bilal was freed as a slave. Sahih Bukhari continues to say, the freed slave of Ibn Abbas, that Maymuna bint al-Harith, told him that she manumitted a slave girl without taking the permission of the Prophet. On the day when it was her turn to be with the Prophet, she said, do you know, O Allah's apostle, that I have manumitted my slave girl? He, that's Muhammad, said, have you really? She replied in the affirmative and said, you would have got more reward if you had given her, in other words, a slave girl, to one of your maternal uncles. So here you have a contradiction. Muhammad frees a slave, but then he said it's better if he hadn't for the woman that wanted a slave, free her slave. Sahih Muslim goes on. Ibn Husayn reported that a person who had no other property emancipated 6 slaves of his at the time of his death. Well, that seems right. Until Allah's messenger comes along, called for them and divided them into 3 sections, cast lots amongst them, and set 2 free, and kept 4 in slavery. And he, the Holy Prophet, spoke severely of him. Can you see these contradictions here? It looks like Muhammad at one point is saying, yes, emancipate one, but keep the others or divide them up. So why did he emancipate Bilal? Ask your Muslim friends this. And there's a reason why he emancipated Bilal. Because he was a muezzin. He had a beautiful voice. He needed him in the towers. That's why he emancipated him. It had nothing to do with his importance otherwise, other than the fact that he could use him for another reason. Sahih Bukhari continues on, a man manumitted a slave, and he had no other property than that. So the Prophet canceled the manumission and sold the slaves for him, proving that Muhammad was not against slavery. He was very much for slavery. He very much used slavery as a way of compensating others and as a way of also, like with like, paying off for their recompense. Sahih Bukhari continues with Muhammad. The Prophet said the freed slave belongs to the people who have freed him, or said something similar, proving that this is not really an emancipation. And these examples that people give about Muhammad show that he pretty much did what he wanted with the slaves he had. Now we get to colorism. What about colorism? What are we going to do with this? The farewell sermon is the one that Muslims love to bring up. Now, we don't know the context for the farewell sermon. We don't know when it was written. As we're finding out, much of this is written much, much later in redacted back. Redacted means put back on a different time period. But according to the farewell sermon, someone who heard the sermon of the Messenger of Allah in the middle of the day of Tashriq narrated to me that he said, O people, indeed your Lord is one and your Father is one. Indeed, there is no superiority of an Arab over a non-Arab, nor of a non-Arab over an Arab, nor of a white over a black, nor black over a white, except by taqwa have I conveyed the message. They replied, you have conveyed it, Messenger of Allah. That seemed to suggest that Muhammad was saying we're all alike. White with white, black over white, no one's superior to the other, that everybody's the same. It almost sounds like it's been taken out right out of the Bible, doesn't it? Galatians 3:28. Tabari, volume 9, pages 112 to 113. Listen to my words. This is still in the farewell sermon. O people, for I have conveyed the message and understand it. Know for certain that every Muslim is a brother of another Muslim, and that all Muslims are brethren. It is not lawful for a person to take for his brother except that which he has given him willingly. So do not wrong yourselves. O Allah, I have now conveyed the message. When you read the rest of the farewell sermon, you'll see the context that Muhammad's referring about. Even if this was written much later, it's only to do with Muslims. Are you following that? So you need to read the entire farewell sermon to realize that this has nothing to say that one is equal to the other. It's only one Muslim is equal to another. Ibn Hazm in the 10th century talks about emancipation. God has decreed that the most devout is the noblest, even if he be a negress's bastard, and that the sinner and unbeliever is at the lowest level, even if he is to be the son of the prophets. Isn't it fascinating? You can see the distinction. Almost they're looking at two criteria. The lowest is the negress's bastard, and the highest is the son of the prophets, suggesting that they are at the bottom of the totem pole. Sunan Ibn Majah, volume 1, do not marry women for their beauty, which may destroy them, or for their money, which may corrupt them. For religion, a slit-nosed black slave woman, if pious, is preferable. You can already see that the words they're using here are very derogatory concerning black people. Muhammad had very strong views on the black color. Mughafal reported the Apostle of Allah, Muhammad, as saying, "Were dogs not a species of creature, I should command that they all be killed, but kill every pure black one." The Prophet did not order the killing of all dogs, for some are to be retained for hunting and watching. He ordered to kill the jet black ones. They might be more mischievous than among them. Already you start to see this idea of being black is inferior, being black is being evil. Strong views on black continues. Abdar reported, this messenger of Allah said, when any one of you stands for prayer and there is a thing before him equal to the back of a saddle that covers him, and in the case there is not before him a thing equal to the back of the saddle, his prayer would be cut off by passing of an ass woman and a black dog. I said, O Abu Badar, what feature is there in a black dog which distinguish it from the red dog and the yellow dog? He said, O son of my brother, I asked the messenger of Allah as you are asking me, and he said, the black dog is a devil. Have any of you heard these quotes before? These are probably all new to you. These were new to us. I had not heard these before. And yet these are all found in their own traditions. Bukhari, strong views on black again. The Prophet said, I saw in a dream a black woman with unkempt hair going out of Medina and settling in Mahia. I interpret that as an epidemic of Medina being transferred to Mahia, namely Al-Jufa. A black woman is equal to an epidemic. It was narrated that Jabbar said, Abu Kuhafa, what was brought on the day of the conquest of Mecca? And his hair and beard were white like the tagama. The messenger of Allah said, change this with something, but avoid black. Now we come to the whole hierarchy within society. And this is something you'll find within Islam. There is an enormous amount of hierarchy. And look and see who and what make up the hierarchy. Piety overweighs blackness, and impiety overweighs whiteness. Alam al-Dudi says, Islam is not just a religion, but a revolutionary ideology and program which seeks to alter the social order and rebuild it in conformity with its own tenets and ideas. And what is this order? Well, let's see what Al-Tabari said, who is the first to write the tafsir in the 10th century. Arabs are the most noble people in lineage, the most prominent and the best indeed. So it turns out that those who are at the top of the hierarchy are the Arabs themselves. We were the first to respond to the call of the Prophet. We are Allah's helpers and the viziers of his messenger. We fight people until they believe in Allah. He who believes in Allah and his messenger has protected his life and possessions from us. As for one who disbelieves, we will fight him forever in Allah's cause. Killing him is a small matter to us. Again, Ibn Taymiyyah, writing in the 13th century and the 14th century, a man married a maid servant who bore him a child. Would that child be free, or would he be an owned slave? Her child whom she bore from him would be the property of her master, according to all the imams, heads of the 4 Islamic schools of law. Because the child follows the status of his mother in freedom or slavery. If the child is not of the race of Arabs, then he is definitely an owned slave, according to the scholars. Isn't that interesting? So the definition of whether you are a slave or not is whether you belong to an Arab. But the scholars disputed among themselves if he was born from the Arabs, whether he must be enslaved or not, because when Aisha had a maid slave who was an Arab, Muhammad said to Aisha, "Set this maid free, because she is from the children of Ishmael." Fascinating, the definition of who the slaves were to be. So what happened prior to what we know as the transatlantic slave trade, which began in 1400 BC? 1400 AD. Take a look at the timeline there. You see 1407 over there on the right. Look at all these names. I just want you to look at these names. These are household names. Al-Jahiz, Ibn Qutayba, Al-Tabari. They're from the 9th up until the 10th century. Al-Muqaddasi in the 10th century. Ibn Sina in the 11th century. Jumping up to Nasr al-Din al-Tusi in the 13th century. Ibn Taymiyyah, the 14th century. And Ibn Khaldun in the late 14th century. Take a look at these names. These may not be familiar to you coming from the West, but any Muslim will know these names. These would be the John Calvins. These would be the Luthers. These would be the great men of God, the Augustines of the Muslim world. These are the ones that every Muslim follows. What we're going to do is look at how they look and see what they said about black people, about Africans. All of this is before the European slave trade. So this predates long before Europeans got into this. Look at Al-Jahiz, 9th century. We know that the Zanj, that's the name in Arabic for blacks, are the least intelligent and the least discerning of mankind, and the least capable of understanding the consequences of actions. Al-Jahiz goes on to say, like the crow among mankind are the Zanj, African blacks, for they are the worst of men and most vicious of creatures in character, in temperament. Al-Jahiz also says, they, the Shu'ubiyah, which is a group amongst the Zanj, maintain that eloquence is prized by all people at that time. Even the Zanj, which are the black Africans, despite their dimness, their boundless stupidity, their obtuseness, their crude perceptions, and their evil dispositions, make long speeches. Now, how many of you heard these quotes before? And when you ask Muslims, they're not even aware that these great men of God would say such things long before the Europeans got into this. Blacks are ugly and misshapen because they live in a hot country, according to Ibn Qutayba in the 9th century. Al-Muqaddasi, writing in the 10th and 11th century, of the neighbors of the Buja, Muqaddasi had heard that there is no marriage among them, and the child does not know his father, and they eat people, but God knows best. As for the Zanj, they are the people of black color, flat noses, kinky hair, and little understanding or intelligence. Ibn Sina, household name. Everybody knows this name. In the 10th and 11th century, blacks are people who are by the very nature slaves. Nasr al-Din al-Tusi, writing in the 13th century, if all types of men are taken from the first and one placed after another, like the Negro from Zanzibar in the southernmost country, the Negro does not differ from an animal in anything except the fact that his hands have been lifted from the earth. In no other peculiarity or property, except for what God wished. Many have seen that the ape is more capable of being trained than the Negro and more intelligent. Can you imagine repeating this today? And yet this is something Muslims have never read. When we read these to Muslims, they say, this can't be Nasr saying this. No man of God would say this. And yet this is not being permitted to be brought into our schools in America. And yet, can you understand, when black Afro-Americans start reading this, if they start to read, this is the religion they're adopting, because it has no problem with slavery, it has no problem with coloration or colorism. They've got to go back and see how people who are the greatest thinkers of Islam, this is what they thought of Afro-Americans, of Africans. Ibn Khaldun, listen, Khaldun, you all know this name. Highly prized amongst Muslims. Therefore, the Negro nation are, as a rule, submissive to slavery because Negroes have little that is essentially human and have attributes that are quite similar to those of dumb animals, as we have stated. Beyond known peoples of black West Africa, to the south, there is no civilization in the proper sense. There are only humans who are closer to dumb animals than to rational beings. They live in thickets and caves and eat herbs and unprepared grain. They frequently eat each other. They cannot be considered human beings. I mean, to me, it's just absolutely heinous to read this kind of stuff. And yet this comes from the greatest thinkers of Islam. Take a look and see where the timeline is, just to remind you what we're talking about. Edward William Lane on Egyptian slavery, he talks about Egyptian slavery, and he says the price of a white slave girl is usually from the treble to tenfold that of an Abyssinian, and the price of a black girl about half or two-thirds, or considerably more if well instructed in the art of cookery. The black slaves are generally employed as menials. So looking and understanding when they're in Egypt, he could see this differentiation. Yet what's interesting is when you look at Muhammad, take a look at what Al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim and Ibn Dan, look at the traditions say about Muhammad, that he had white legs, that he had a white forearm, that Muhammad had white armpits, that he had white abdomen and belly, that he had white skin, that he had a handsome white face. I wasn't aware of this until Sarah showed me this. When you look at how the description of Muhammad is, he is not a black, he's very much a white. Why are the Arabs so concerned that Muhammad be white? Unless there is this coloration, this colorism already imbued in their very thinking. They wanted so much to believe that he was a white man. The appearance of Muhammad, not completely white, according to Al-Bukhari, chapter 4, 56. And then Ibn Musa al-Yasunbi says, anyone who says the Prophet was black should be killed. Fascinating. Can you see why we've got to get this into schools? Why Muslims need to read. This is the elephant in the room that they have not talked about. This is their great men of God, and this is how they felt about black people. Colorism in Islam. Pre-Islamic view on color, pre-Islamic literature. This is before the 7th century. When you look at Arab literature, according to Bernard Lewis, he said sometimes describe themselves as black in contrast to Persians, who are red, but at other times as red or white in contrast with Africans, who are black. The characteristic color of the Bedouin is variously stated as olive or brown. So there was not a problem. Prior to Islam, there was not a problem with coloration amongst the Arabs. They really did not have any idea of looking down on black people. They themselves even noted at the times that they were black. During the period immediately following the death of the Prophet in 632 AD, the great Islamic conquest took the new faith to vast areas of Asia and also to Africa. A new situation was created, and many changes can be observed in the literature of the time. The first of these is the narrowing, specializing, and fixing of color terms applied to human beings. In time, almost all disappear apart from black, red, and white, and these become ethnic and absolute instead of personal and relative. Together with this specialization in fixing of color terms comes a very clear connotation of inferiority attached to darker and more specifically black skins. So this seems to have been introduced immediately after the time of Muhammad. Looks like it's Islam that introduced this idea of the heinousness of the black skin or the black color. Attitudes in literature, early Islamic period. Take a look at African origin poem Suhain in 660. If my color were pink, women would love me. But the Lord has marred me with blackness. Though I am a slave, my soul is nobly free. Though I am black of color, my character is white. I am covered with a black garment, but under it there is a lustrous garment of white skirts. Even this, can you see the colorisms coming in to their poetry? This is 660. This is 30 years after Muhammad's death. 776, now we're another few generations later. We are alike in color, our faces are black and ugly, our name are shameful. What happened from before Islam versus the introduction of Islam? Jahiz of Basra that we referred to earlier, it is part of your ignorance that in the time of heathendom, that is pre-Islamic Arabia, you regarded us blacks as good enough to marry your women, yet when justice of Islam came, you considered this wrong. Even he recognized that Islam brought this idea that there's something wrong with the black people, and you wouldn't let us marry those of us who are black. When we look at the Quran and the Hadith, the Quran, of course, being the original, their primary revelation, the Hadith being secondary revelation, Bernard Lewis says black is somehow connected with sin, evil, deviltry, and damnation, while white has the opposite associations. Surah 3, Ayah 106, on the day, that means the day of resurrection, when some faces will become white and some faces will become black. As for those whose faces will become black, to them will be said, did you reject faith after accepting it? Then taste the torment in hell for rejecting faith. So those who are going to hell have black faces. Surah 39, Ayah 60, and on the day of resurrection you will see those who lied about Allah with their faces blackened, is there not in hell a residence for the arrogant? Again, suggesting there's something wrong with the color black, even in the Quran. In the traditions of the Hadith, Jami al-Tirmidhi, one of the six most authoritative Hadith, Ibn Abbas narrated saying, the Messenger of Allah said, the black stone descended from paradise, and it was more white than milk. Then it was blackened by the sins of the children of Adam. That's the black stone that's now in the Kaaba. Al-Bukhari narrated Anas ibn Malik saying, Allah's Messenger said, you should listen to and obey your ruler even if he was an Ethiopian black slave whose head looks like a raisin. Sunan al-Nasa, another one of the six, Musa al-Masabi, narrates this, that Jabbar said a slave came and pledged the Prophet to emigrate, and the Prophet did not realize that he was a slave. Then his master came looking for him. The Prophet said, sell him to me, and he bought him for 2 black slaves. Then he did not accept the pledge for anyone else until he asked, is he a slave? What about the treatment of black slaves? Dr. John Nzuma has probably done the best work on looking at slavery. He himself is from Ghana. He was a descendant of slavers. It had bothered him that his family were the ones that enslaved others and then sold them to the Arabs. So he decided to do his doctoral thesis here at the University of Birmingham, here in Birmingham. And he came up with his thesis just about 10 years ago, and he was the one that actually looked at the numbers, looking from the east and the west coast. And he noted that in areas like North Africa, the Middle East, and Turkey, black slaves did the meanest and hardest work. The first generation and plantation slaves in Muslim lands were as harsh and cruel as any other such system, while successive generations of all slaves had to live under the weight and stigma of racial and social discrimination. Al-Tabari talks about the Zanj, the African blacks employed in groups of 500 to 5,000 in salt marshes of southern Iraq. Their condition was extremely bad, and they were literally pinned down there hopeless and homeless. This bad treatment led to numerous slave revolts beginning in 689 AD. And when you look at the map of Africa, just take a look and see where Mecca and Medina is. You can see it there on the map. And take a look at the concentric brown lines that move out further and further from the dark brown to the lighter brown to the pink and then to the yellow. Those are the ages of growth. When you look at Islam, you will see it grew starting from Medina, moving out and out further and further until by 639 and then 661 it had controlled. And by 685, by the end of the 7th century, it controlled all the way from Senegal in West Africa all the way to the Mongol Empire, which is northern India and the western coast of India. So from India in the west to Senegal in the east. The other way around. Senegal in the west to India in the east. From 639 AD, the trade routes from Africa and Asia, and take a look where most of the trade routes went. Interesting thing is, the Africans didn't go on that trade route. So where did this all come from? Where did this slave come from? Now, historian David Goldenberg states that this idea of the blacks being inferior came from the idea of the curse of Ham. In the 7th century, we begin to see the expressions Banu Ham, Arabic, and Bani Ham, Hebrew, being used as synonyms for black African. This was introduced in the 7th century. Historian Rotter states, during the first 3 Islamic centuries, Banu Ham appears quite often as synonyms for black African. Banu means children of. Historian David Goldberg continues, we first see this explicit link between skin color and slavery in Near Eastern sources beginning in the 7th century. Notably, it's not before the 7th century. The tradition that Noah uttered a dual curse against his son Ham, cursing him with blackness and with slavery at the same time, is very widespread in Islamic sources. Goldenberg also found versions of the curse of Ham in these Muslim sources. Ibn Atta, 647 to 732. Ham begat all those who are black and curly hair. Noah prayed that the hair of Ham's descendants would not grow beyond their ears, and that wherever his descendants met the children of Shem, the latter would enslave them. Now, where did this idea that Ham was black and curly haired come from? That's not in the Bible. Tabari in 923, Ham begat all those who are black and curly haired. There you see repeated in the 10th century by Tabari. Noah prayed that the hair of Ham's descendants would not grow beyond their ears. The same thing is repeated, and that one would enslave the other. Ibn Khaldun in the 3rd century repeats this idea. Negroes are the children of Ham, the son of Noah, and they were singled out to be black as a result of Noah's curse, which produced Ham's color and the slavery God inflicted upon his descendants. Where is this idea that Ham was black? And that, yes, the idea that he was to be a slave to his brother is clear, but where did this idea come from? Well, we do know that the curse of Ham comes from the Midrash in Genesis in the 5th century. Rabbi Huna said in Rabbi Joseph's name, Noah declared, "You have prevented me from begetting a 4th son, therefore I curse your 4th son." Rabbi Huna also said in Rabbi Joseph's name, "You have prevented me from doing something in the dark, therefore your seed will be ugly and dark-skinned." He has said, "Ham and the dog copulated in the ark, therefore Ham came black-skinned, while the dog publicly exposes his copulation." It looks like this is where they got the roots from. This could be this source, written in the 5th century in a midrash, which is an apocryphal writing, a Jewish apocryphal writing about the curse of Ham. This is the earliest that we see this idea of Ham being black. The Babylonian Talmud in the 6th century, which is very much the same time period, says that the rabbis thought 3 copulated in the ark, and they were all punished: the dog, the raven, and Ham, the son Ham. The dog was doomed to be tied, and the raven expectorates her seed into her mate's mouth, and Ham was smitten in his skin. So far, the quotes, Ham became black-skinned, Ham was smitten in his skin. What is wrong with these quotes? Well, here's the problem. Let's take a look and see if these are biblical. In Genesis 9:25, we have the curse of Ham. "As a servant of servants shall be to his brothers." When we read Genesis 9:22, "And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his 2 brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took the garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backwards and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backward, and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had been done to him, he said, 'Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers.'" Where is there any notion that Canaan or Ham, was black here or had curly hair? Not in the Bible. The Ethiopian scholar Ephraim Isaac, in rabbinic literature, referring to those 2 quotes that we saw from the 5th century, we do not have or find an implication that the descendants of the accursed Canaan are black or African people. Indeed, there was never a question in rabbinic thought. It was Cush and not Canaan who inhabited Africa south of Egypt. So here you get, according to Goldenberg, the claim that 2 Agadic folk tales representing 0.0006% of the overall Talmudic corpus and transmitted by 2 of 1,500 personalities represents the Talmudic view sounds a little ridiculous. Taking only 2 references out of 1,500 references and saying this is what the Bible is saying. But these were only introduced in the 5th century AD. Can you see the problem? How did these attitudes, not in the Bible, get into Islam, therefore? The Cave of Treasures, Ephraim in Syria, in 373 AD, and Canaan was cursed because he had dared to do this, and his seed became a servant of servants. That is to say, to the Egyptians, and the Cushites, and the Mysians, and the Indians, and all the Ethiopians whose skins are black. And because Ham had dared to make a mock of his father, he was called vile, or lascivious, all the days of his life. From 639, we have the Arab conquest into Africa, and there is very little evidence of slave raids in Africa before the Muslim involvement. An Ashanti ruler stated, which is interesting, this predates the Muslim coming into Africa, "I cannot make war to catch slaves in the bush like a thief. My ancestors never did so," suggesting that this was not something that was done before Islam. In 652, the penetration of Islam, we find an agreement made between Muslim Egypt and Christian Nubia requiring Nubia to supply 360 slaves annually to Egypt. In addition to 360, another 40 were sent annually, either for the Arab officials handling the transaction to compensate for an estimated 10% loss during the transport. It looks like this whole idea of slavery was introduced then in the 650s, or roughly from about 20 years after Muhammad, going up to Egypt. David Bryan Davis comments that by the 8th and 9th century, Arab writers were then writing, increasingly invoked the biblical curse of Canaan to explain why the sons of Ham had been blackened and degraded to the status of natural slaves as punishment for their ancestors' sin. But where did this curse of Canaan support any notion that these were Africans or blacks? William Evans observes that by the 10th century, the curse had been modified to exempt Egyptians and Berbers. Well, isn't that convenient? Arab Islamic slave raids, therefore, are a precursor to the transatlantic slave trades. Edwin Yamuchi concludes, "We see that over the centuries, an obscure text," these 2 texts that we see from the 6th century, was so interpreted by medieval Jews to explain the blackness of Africans, and was then used in turn by Arabs, Europeans, and North Americans to justify slavery, and until recently by Mormons to exclude blacks from their priesthood. Bernard Lewis says the myth of Islamic racial innocence was a Western creation and served a Western purpose. Then in the 18th century, the philosophers of the Enlightenment had praised Islam for its lack of dogmas and mysteries, its freedom from priests and inquisitions and other persecutors, recognizing real qualities but exaggerating them as a polemical weapon against Christian churches and clergy, and completely sloughing over the other quotations that we read earlier from Islam concerning black people. Goldenberg says Lewis did not find any anti-black sentiment in Arabia until the 7th century conquest of Africa and the enslavement of its inhabitants. Snowden and Thompson similarly did not find a prejudiced view of blacks in ancient Greece and Rome. In those earlier times, color did not define a person and was not a criterion for categorizing humanity. Categorizing humanity. In fact, slaves were of all colors. There was no distinction of one color over another. James Harrell then says that Roman slaveholders were neither paternalistic nor racist in the modern sense of the term. Race itself is a modern construct. Although there was views about differing ethnicities in antiquity, there was no so-called scientific theory of skin-colored race until the 19th century. Goldenberg goes on, we first see this explicit link between skin color and slavery in Near Eastern sources beginning in the 7th century. We note its first appearance in Christian West as soon as Europe discovered black Africa and began to engage in the slave trade. And there you can see a map of the slave trade. Now take a look. Even in this map, what's wrong with the map? What's going wrong on the right side? Look at the green lines of East Africa coming down around the Cape. There is no known documentation of any ships coming around the Cape of Good Hope for one very good reason. They couldn't have lasted. No ships could go around there because it was so dangerous. And there would be no reason to take East African coast slaves over to the West. All the slavery that went to the Americas came from the West Coast. What's missing in this map are the numbers. The numbers are missing here. When you look at the numbers, let's just go back. Those who have done the numbers before Dr. John Azuma did, are Austin, Lovejoy. These are the two that probably have done the most work. And when you look at the numbers, I don't know if you can see it there, take a look at the entire Atlantic slave trade, and they put the Atlantic slave in millions to 11.7 million. Do you see that there? Can you see that right down? And the slides millions come over from the Atlantic slave trade. The Islamic total is 17 million. Can you see all the red lines going from North Africa? Where did all those slaves go to? They all went up to the Middle East. And he said that you need to add as well. And that's where he came up from anywhere from 18 to 19 million that left the North Africa and the east coast of Africa, all of them going up into the Middle East. Dr. Ajama Zuma noticed that 11 to 12 million left the west coast of Africa. We know where their progeny are, around 100 million. Whereas 17 to 18 million left the east coast of Africa. We don't know where their progeny are. There should be about 140 million. This is the elephant in the room that Muslims have not dealt with. They have not dealt with their slave past, nor have they dealt with the progeny of those slaves, the descendants of those slaves. Where are their descendants today? Why can't we see wholesale descendants? There is a reason, and this is what John Azuma found. He noticed that in Africa, Islamic slave raids, 2 out of every 3 slaves were women. They didn't need men for one very good reason. The transatlantic slave trade, 2 out of every 3 slaves were men. And the reason why is because the Atlantic slave trade needed men to work the plantations in Haiti, Dominican Republic, Brazil, southern United States. They needed more men because they needed workers. That's why they brought the wives along to make sure that they were taken care of, that the women could take care of their men, and also for progeny so that they could have children. Because the more children you have, the more slaves you could have. African Muslim slave trade did not need men. They needed women, mainly for sex. These are for their harems. Therefore, they destroyed the men. They killed off the men, except certain numbers of men. 15% of the men were kept, and they were castrated as eunuchs to take care of the women. What John Azuma found when he looked at these castrated eunuchs, 85% of them never survived the trip because of their wounds. 85% of the eunuchs never survived the trip. Why have we not heard this before? This has never been brought to the public. Mortality rate for the for the Islamic slave trade was 80 to 90% died on the way. The mortality rate for the transatlantic slave trade was 10%. We've heard about the 10%. We know about that. There's lots of documentation for that. We don't try to hide it. We expose it, and we ask forgiveness for it. It was horrendous that 10% lost their lives. Why haven't Islam dealt with the 80 to 90% mortality rate? Can you see why Islam has an awful lot to answer for? For the Islamic slave trade, the purpose was mainly for sexual exploitation, whereas the transatlantic slave trade, the purpose was mainly for agricultural work. They needed them for their plantations. The Islamic slave trade in Africa, there were few descendants have survived. We see very few. You can see some of their descendants in Libya today, and also in Egypt, and also in Algeria and in North Africa. But rarely do you find any of them in the Middle East, because they were no men. They only used the women as concubines. The transatlantic slave trade, many descendants survive today. We can see their progeny. There's about 120 million of them around the world, 100 to 120 million. And therefore, you can see the numbers that are below there, those who survived and their progeny. The Islamic slave raids in Europe were from Sicily to Italy to Cornwall to England. They included white slaves. There was an entire white slave trade in North Africa. Many people don't realize that the Muslims also came to Europe and enslaved Europeans. And that's why the Americans came into it and finally stopped the slave trade. It was the U.S. Marines, and that's why we have it in our U.S. Marine hymn. From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Where are the shores of Tripoli? That was to stop the white slave trade in the Mediterranean. The purpose were for galley slaves, laborers, and sexual exploitation. Now, the European slave trade lasted from the 16th to the 19th century, and 1.25 million were enslaved amongst the Europeans. Most people don't talk about that. We don't know about that. We have lost that. We don't like to bring it up. In the Americas, the American seamen in the Atlantic, about 130 were captured, so even the American seamen were part of that. Now, the reaction that we have found here is almost entirely against Christianity in the West. Almost all of the narrative in my country is against Christianity, that Christianity is uniquely a slave religion, whereas Islam has nothing to answer for. That narrative hasn't even begun in America. Sarah, going down to Gambia, was the first to do so. When she introduced this just last week, so many of the students were upset with her, but when she talked to her professor, the professor that invited her, he said, "This is the first we're hearing this, we need you to come back," and they've asked her to go back next year. So we're introducing it into the West Coast, and Gambia is the first. I'd like to take it up to Senegal, where I stayed for 5 years, and start translating this into French. We need to take it to Nigeria. We need to take it to Ghana. We need to take it back to where many of the slaves came from, and we need to say, you've got to deal with Islamic slave trade. It is much greater than anything that happened in the transatlantic, and it is only the transatlantic slave trade that was stopped. When you look at the Bible, there's a whole study here we can't go into. There's not enough time because I say I only have 5 minutes. Exodus 21:16, it says, "Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him, shall be put to death." Galatians 3:27, "For as many of you as were baptized in Christ have put on Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is no male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." And we mentioned this earlier today. And it was verses like this, and 1 Timothy 1:8. "Now we understand that law is good, but one uses it lawfully, understanding this, that the law is not laid down for the just, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the ungodly and sinners, for the unholy and profane, for those who strike their fathers and mothers, for murderers, the sexual immoral, men who practice homosexuality, enslavers," is right there. That is also seen as unlawful, and there it is in 1 Timothy 1:8. But probably the best verse against slavery is Philemon. The book of Philemon. Here is Paul sending Philemon back to his slave owner. And look what he says. "Though I am bold enough in Christ, I appeal you, Philemon, for my child Onesimus, whose father I became in my imprisonment. For this perhaps is why he was parted from you for a while, that you might have him back forever, no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, as a beloved brother." So he redefines the whole relationship between a slave and a slaver as no longer a slave and a slaver. Now you are brothers in Christ. Redefines it there in verse 16. So if you consider me to be your partner, receive him as you would receive me, confident of your obedience. You are to treat him like you treat me. He is to be equal, no longer your slave. Beautiful when you see that. Slavery in the Bible, that it was a consequence of the fall. All experienced slavery to sin. God is no respecter of persons. A great example is the children of Israel in Egypt, and the greatest example is Jesus himself. So when you do a comparison, let's just do a comparison with Islam and Christianity when it comes to slavery. Islam, you are a slave to Allah, you're still a slave to Allah. In Christianity, you're made in God's image, a slave to sin, but through Christ, you become a child of God. And take a look and just do a comparison between a child of God and a slave of God. A slave of God over here, well, as you can tell, I say to my Muslim friends, if you're a slave of God, remember, the most popular name for a young boy after Muhammad is Abdul. Abdul Rahman. Abdul means slave of. One of the names of God. So whenever you hear someone called Abdul, he is a slave. And that's how they look at themselves vis-a-vis their God. They are slaves to God. So a slave of God, can he talk to his father? Did I say father? Boy, slap me in the face. Can he talk to his master? Absolutely not. Can a child talk to their father? Yes, they can. Can a slave argue with the master? No, they cannot. Can a child argue with his father? You should know, I'm a father. I have 3 sons. Can a slave critique his master? Absolutely not. Can a child critique their father? Yes, of course. Can a slave reject his master on pain of death? Can a child reject their father? Absolutely. Look at the prodigal son. One of the best stories we have in the New Testament is a son who rejects their father. And what does the father do? The father waits and waits at the door, waiting for his son to come home. See, the God we have treats us as children of God, not as slaves of God. And as children of God, we can reject our Father, but he always is waiting for us to come home again. And when he sees us in a distance, he runs out and he grabs his son and he brings him back to a feast. He rejoices when his son comes home. That's the kind of relationship we have to God. We are children of God. Muslims will always be slaves of Allah. They never lose that capacity. William Wilberforce says the private faith that does not act on the face of oppression is no faith at all. When you look at the comparisons between Christianity, Christian narrative, and Islam, Christianity is on this side, right? Or is Christianity on this side? Sorry, I'm looking backwards here. So Christianity on this side, the narrative is slavery to freedom. Islam, slavery to slavery. Christianity, it's voluntary. Islam, it's involuntary. Freedom in Yahweh was always the plan. Slave to Allah was always the plan. Jesus did not trade in or own slaves. Muhammad traded and owned many slaves. Jesus set the world free. Muhammad bought more slaves than he freed. Our freedom was costly. Freedom is a mere monetary value. Color not important in Christianity. Color is absolutely frequently mentioned amongst the scholars. God himself fought for our freedom. Muhammad fought to capture slaves. Abolitions were all uniquely Christians. The only abolition movements we can see were all run by Christians. Many of them by the Quakers in this country. It was the Quakers who were at the forefront of the abolition movement here. Long before Wilberforce got into it, it was the Quakers who were the ones that wanted to eradicate slavery. The Moravians, the other great group, many of whom even became slaves so they could preach the gospel to them. They took on slavery themselves so they could go on the slave ships and actually preach the gospel, knowing they'd be slaves for life. They found it that important. You don't find any of that. There's no abolition. I've asked many Muslims, can you show me one abolition movement of abolition of slavery? There is none. We just can't find any in 1400 years. It doesn't exist. From 1807 to 1815, Europeans eradicated slavery. Saudi Arabia did not eradicate it until 1960. Mauritania in 1981. That was under duress of the United Nations. The USA has had a war against slavery. There is no war in Islam to eradicate slavery. European countries have admitted and apologized for the slavery. Muslim nations have never apologized, even recognized that they had slaves. Slavery does not exist today in the West. Only Muslim countries still enslave. This was done by Baroness Cox, I don't know, from here in London. She went down to Sudan, she went to Mali, and she bought slaves on camera to show that they still exist today. She filmed it, and then she freed them on camera to show that it still exists today and only in Muslim countries. Caused a huge furore when she did that. Black people black people choose their name, whereas today in Islam, the name for black people is Abid. That is a name for slave. That Abid means slave. Even the name in Arabic for a black person is slave. It's imbued even into the language. Black people immigrated to Europe. Few blacks go to Arab countries today anymore. Christianity has an answer for slave. Islam has no answer. Has not even dealt with it. Conclusion, Galatians 5:1. For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. Folks, we need to get this out into the public sphere. We need to have especially Afro-Americans and Afro-Caribbeans to hear this, because there is a hemorrhaging happening within the Afro-Caribbean churches and the Afro-American churches, because they don't know how to deal with their slave past. When in reality, Islam is coming and saying, come on to us, because we don't have a problem with slavery. Yet Islam has an enormous problem with slavery, which they have yet to recognize. When you look at the historical environment, when you look at the manuscripts, when you look at the Quran, when you look at the traditions, when you look at these great men of Islam and look and see what they felt about black people, when you quote them verbatim, Ibn Khaldun, Ibn Sina, Ibn Taymiyyah, these are household names. Muslims need to deal with their slave problem. And they need to come back to Jesus Christ. For there is no slave nor free. All are equal in Jesus Christ. Good. Thanks for your time.